Hello, everyone. I'm Sally Kinney, and welcome to the second half of Season 2 of Deconstructing Rape, the podcast for academics, survivors, and activists seeking to understand and mobilize to prevent sexual violence. In Season 1, I spoke with survivor scholars about their experiences of sexual violence and their research findings. In Season 2, I talked with scholar activists about public policies to hold perpetrators of sexual violence accountable, erode rape culture, prevent sexual violence, and help survivors heal. Each episode contains sexually explicit content and adult language. Use discretion when listening. Canadian Sarah Weinman earned her Bachelor of Science degree from McGill University and a Master's degree in Forensic Science from John Jay College. She's a journalist, editor, and crime fiction authority, having written regular crime fiction columns for, among others, The Baltimore Sun, Barnes & Noble Review, LA Times Book Review, and most recently, the monthly crime and mystery column for the New York Times Book Review. Weinman edited the 2-volume compendium, Women Crime Writers, which republished crime fiction by women written in the 1940s and 1950s. She has edited 3 anthologies, Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives in 2013, Unspeakable Acts, True Tales of Crime, Murder, Deceit, and Obsession in 2020, and Evidence of Things Seen, True Crime in an Era of Reckoning in 2023. She is also a prolific essayist and short story writer. She is the author of 3 nonfiction books, The Real Lolita, The Kidnapping of Sally Horner, and the novel that scandalized the world in 2018, Scoundrel, How a Convicted Murderer Persuaded the Women Who Loved Him, the Conservative Establishment, and the Courts to Set Him Free in 2022, and most relevant for this podcast, Without Consent, a landmark trial and the decades-long struggle to make spousal rape a crime in 2025. Without Consent tells the story of Greta Rideout, the first woman to testify against her husband under Oregon's new law prohibiting marital rape in 1978, one of only 4 states to do so. Weinman learned about the case from reading journalist and novelist Helen Benedict's 1992 book, Virgin or Vamp, How the Press Covers Sex Crimes. Many saw the case as an outrage or a joke, including John Rideout's lawyer, who opined that rape was a risk of being married, and one California state senator opined, if you can't rape your wife, who can you rape? Despite strong evidence that John was often violent, including the night in question, and beat and raped Greta in front of their 2.5-year-old daughter, the jury acquitted him after only 2.5 hours of deliberation to the applause of the courtroom. When the young couple shortly thereafter reunited, many who understood little about either intimate partner violence or sexual assault scorned Greta. John went on to be a repeat offender, and Weinman attended his 2022 trial for sexual assault, which resulted in a conviction. Weinman closely examines the initial case that catapulted the young couple into a media sensation and marked them forever, and provides interesting and new evidence about the campaign to outlaw marital rape that it inspired, the last state finally outlawing it only in 1993, led by one activist in particular, Laura X. The book brilliantly captures how the criminal justice system and the wider public refuse to take either sexual assault or intimate partner violence seriously and hold perpetrators accountable, treating women and girls as expendable. Well, Sarah, I'm so delighted to have you on the program. And as I said, I've been really, I don't know if enjoying is the right word, but fascinated and intrigued and totally engrossed in reading of so much of your work. And I can't wait to start reading some of your fiction now. So
gosh, thank you.
So let's go ahead and get in our topic today and not get too distracted by your many different areas of accomplishment. In Without Consent, you say that you started off with an interest in the rape of Cheryl Araujo, if that's how you say her name.
It's Araujo.
Cheryl Araujo, in the New Bedford, Massachusetts rape case, gang rape, portrayed by Jodie Foster in the film The Accused, which Helen Benedict also wrote about in her 1992 study, Virgin or Vamp, How the Press Covers Sex Crimes. And you mentioned that two things drew you to the case, that you were surprised that you hadn't really heard that much about the absence of the prohibition against marital rape before that time, and you were shocked that it was only outlawed in the 1970s. So what drew you to turn from Araujo to Rideout? And is it, as in the case of the real Lolita, your concern generally of the stories of women victims being lost when they become characters in other people's story, or the bizarre fact that John Rideout was being tried again for sexual assault, or some other thing, or a combination of things?
That is a lot to unpack in a question. And so let me sort of backtrack and start with what it was like to read about the Rideout case in Helen Benedict's book. So yes, as you mentioned, initially I had sought out that book because I was doing some initial research and reporting on the Cheryl Araujo case, which I had known about even from a very young age, and I knew about the accused, but I was just really struck by the idea that there was much more of that story to tell. The reason I still have not told that story is just for a number of, I suppose, logistical reasons. You write up a pitch and a publication has their reasons for not taking it. But I was also curious about how Benedict wrote about the coverage of the case and just how unbelievably wrong things went in terms of how the media, both locally and nationally, really kind of missed the boat on a lot of the nuanced interactions of the Portuguese community there. Cheryl herself was from that community. Her rapists were as well. But it just became almost this like turbocharged case about anti-immigration, but also victim blaming. And then poor Cheryl's name, I mean, the reason we can say this on the podcast, she was named in court, and that shouldn't have happened.
And that's not, the Portuguese part really isn't, immigrant part wasn't really a part of the film particularly.
No, they changed a lot of the story to make it, I suppose, more palatable for American audiences. So that just didn't enter the equation. They just wanted to tell sort of the bare bones of that story. So needless to say, it's a story that I would like to revisit at some point. But as you mentioned, there was this other chapter in Virgin or Vamp on Oregon versus Rideout, which I had never heard of. And I read through it and I thought, well, why haven't I heard of this? This seems to be the first major marital rape case in American history. It got a lot of coverage. It was adapted into a TV movie.
Right.
And yet here I am, and this is around 2017, and I know nothing about this. So as is my wont, I start researching on the internet. And then I learn what happened to the original husband and wife in question, Greta and John Rideout, and how their lives diverged wildly, not immediately after the verdict, but, within a couple of years. And so I knew that there was this narrative arc that I could explore, but I knew that the book that I wanted to write wasn't just about Greta and John and the trial and what happened to them many years later, but that there was this untold story of the struggle to legalize spousal rape. Because, of course, at the time of Oregon versus Rideout, which took place in December of 1978, only 4 states made marital rape a crime. And all 50 did not do so until 1993. So what happened in the intervening 15 years? How did it take so long for marital rape to become a crime, not just in the United States, but almost everywhere I looked? And that going back even as recently as 1974, no states made marital rape a crime. Canada had not. So many countries had not. So what shifted things? That was something that I was very preoccupied with. So all of that is kind of the lead up to how I got started on writing what became Without Consent.
So those of us who are voracious readers are either asked by other people or wonder about ourselves what draws us to these repeated representations of violence against women. And as I mentioned, the Rachel Monroe in Savage Appetites and countless others have tried to grapple with this question. And for me personally, the only thing I really came up with is that as a woman in a male-dominated profession where there was a lot of bullying and shunning, I enjoyed reading about lone woman sleuths somehow conquering the system who were courageous and persevered. And you talk about, I think one of the things that's really interesting about the work you've done, not just in Scoundrel, but in your edited work, is the crime genre is increasingly making greater room for the stories of women embodying their full spectrum as human beings rather than flattening into byproducts of seductive killers. And so you hope that Scoundrel adds to this growing body of nuanced and psychological perceptive work. But perhaps another part of the answer lies, as you mentioned in your edited collection, Evidence of Things Seen, about the ability of crime fiction to expose the fault lines of inequality and injustice. So could you talk a little bit about your thoughts about that?
I generally feel that crime as a genre is a great window into not just how society works, but especially how it doesn't work, and also a window into the most extreme ways that human behavior can bend and often break. I've said this before, but I feel like my work is a way for me to kind of approach an abyss and I can peer into it. And the hope is that it doesn't peer back at me and sort of grab me and take me with it, but that I can just stay on one side of the line. But as a human being, I know that it's very easy to cross that line. It's very thin. It doesn't take much to just tip someone over and then they're committing crimes that are really awful in nature, but they're committed not by outsized boogeymen, they're committed by actual human beings. So as a result, I don't just want to look at individual behavior, although, of course, in the books that I write, the features that I do, the works that I edit, it's really important for me to talk about, just the complexities of humans, and particularly that so many crime narratives seem to privilege certain types of storytelling, be it, the dead white woman who's very beautiful and anything can be projected upon her. And so as a result, her own humanity can get lost in the shuffle. And this sort of over personification with, say, serial killers, at a certain point that just got, to me, it's very boring because I feel like a lot of those men are just kind of banal. They operate out of instincts that they can't even fully comprehend themselves. And there just seems to be repeatable patterns, whereas the people who are harmed by them have always seemed a lot more interesting to me. So that's why, particularly with both The Real Lolita and Scoundrel, where I was examining crimes essentially against young girls or teenage girls, and that their humanity was still in the process of being formed before they were inexorably altered. I mean, in Sally Horner's case, she was kidnapped, subject to a 21-month ordeal, and while she was rescued, she only had a couple more years to live before dying in a tragic car accident. And with Victoria Zelinsky, whose murder precipitated everything that would happen in Scoundrel, it's almost like she didn't really have a chance. She came from a pretty impoverished and probably abusive background. Who knows what kind of life she would have led, but we'll never know because a man killed her. And then in his own bid to puff up his own professed innocence and befriend the people that he befriended, her name got smeared or got subsumed. And so a lot of the work that I'm trying to do is just to excavate the stories of women because they matter and they all matter. And without consent, every survivor of sexual assault that I talk about, from Greta to the two other women that John Rideout is now currently serving time in prison for sexually assaulting, to other victims of spousal rape in various states, all of them matter because no one signs up to be a survivor of sexual assault. It's something that happens. And with a marital rape case, it's something that happens repeatedly And in some ways, at least in my thinking, and certainly after working on this book for as long as I have, it almost seems like, I don't want to say the greater crime because, one-off sexual assault can cause a tremendous amount of trauma and pain that lasts for the rest of a victim's life. But the survivor of intimate partner sexual assault, where they might have children with the perpetrator, where they share a home, share finances, feel completely subsumed financially and emotionally and psychologically by this person that they're waking up to the next morning, and that they have to do whatever it takes to survive before something else may happen again. I mean, that's just a pattern that becomes so corrosive and very difficult to break out of. So looking at people like Greta, who really tried to break that cycle, not entirely successfully at first, though eventually she would figure out a way out of that marriage, just in a very public, shame-filled way. It was very important to kind of get that on the page and explain, no, things happened a lot differently than how people in the late 1970s and even later were learning about it and reading about it. So that's what I mean by trying to excavate what I hope was as close to the truth without trying to get into, without leaning too hard into how people viewed it at the time, that there was a way to kind of remake that narrative.
Well, I think it's right that you say that, now we have, with Jennifer Fried and other people, this measure of institutional betrayal, right? But you document the evidence that shows that the sense of betrayal when somebody you love, somebody in your combat unit, somebody in your workplace, somebody a friend of a friend, an in-law, a family member. I mean, the harm is so much more significant than a stranger rape in terms of your sense of trust. And that's the thing about intimate partner violence. I mean, they may actually love the person and believe that they're going to change, and then they're subject to this repeated violence. Yet we tend to, as you have showed, I mean, that's why I think this book is so important, because it tends to be sort of seen as kind of this boutique-y thing, this subset of rape that hasn't necessarily been that excavated before. But you mentioned, though, that people had been doing research, and that you mentioned the License to Rape book, which reported about 10% of people that they interviewed identified forcible sex as part of their marriage, and that replicated Diana Russell's 1982 studies. And yet, of course, as we know from acquaintance rape in general, that or let alone intimate partner rape, that neither John nor Greta had thought about what was happening between them as rape. Until you recount how Greta, when she sought the help of Helen Biebelheimer at the Women's Crisis Center for being beaten and wanting to be divorced, not necessarily the forced sex as necessarily even being at the top of the list there. She saw that poster that said, if she says no, it's rape. And then something clicked in here. It's not clear when it ever clicked for John, if he ever.
I would say never.
Okay, yeah,
never.
but
I think it was pretty clear when I attended the most recent trial. When he was tried most recently in 2022 for the sexual assault of a former intimate partner. I think my big takeaway, and this came through even in the brief correspondence that I had with him, I don't think he understands what consent even is.
Well, he seemed to say, if I remember correctly, from when the police arrested him, did he say raping your wife is against the law or something like that? But so that kind of suggests that he might have actually thought, oh, it was definitely force, right? It was precipitated by a beating, and then. It's hard to know exactly how much of the fact that it was in front of their 2.5-year-old child as well, right? That was a big thing. But it seems like, even though there is this prevalence and people have been talking about this for at least 50 years, it seems like the same as with acquaintance rape. Why do you think it's so hard to dislodge the stranger rape paradigm, and is that something that like you sought directly to do?
I have a few thoughts on this. One is that it was already incredibly difficult to make society as a whole understand that stranger rape was a thing and that women weren't asking for it and that women should be believed. I mean, cases going far back as the 70s, the 80s, and later, how the women dressed, how they acted, what kind of socioeconomic status they may or may not have had, if there was if there were signs of force, all of those played in, but also that because common law still had it that women, when accusing men of sexual assault, that essentially their narration should never be viewed as reliable, and that judges were issuing instructions to the jurors to take extra care with the testimony of a survivor of sexual assault, that they should essentially take it with all of the grains of salt that they could possibly muster. So getting around that was very difficult. And that's where the rape reform laws of the 70s, spearheaded by many second wave feminists, did a real service, also getting rid of rape shield laws and just generally trying to make things more equitable in a system that I don't know if it can ever fully be equitable. I mean, reporting a sexual assault is so traumatic in itself. It's like you have the trauma of the assault itself, and then you have the secondary trauma of being examined and getting the rape kit done and being interrogated. And you don't know what kind of questions police are going to ask of you and what judgments they're going to bring to the interrogation. And that can be a very bad experience for survivors. And then they have to retell their story, not just in open court, but in preliminary hearings, in mock hearings. They are cross-examined. I mean,
And to their own,
stops.
I mean, I think if I remember right, Greta said it was the preparation from her own attorneys that she found the most traumatic.
That's right, yes. And I think that's so telling because I think psychologically she was steeling herself up for the adversarial element, for being grilled by a defense lawyer. But when it's, quote, your own side, even if it's supposed to prepare you, it just didn't. It undid her. And then, of course, the most important decision made by the judge in advance of the trial is that her sexual history was allowed in.
And his not.
His not. I mean, because of course, he is the defendant. She is a witness. She's not considered to be the plaintiff because this is a criminal case. It's the state that's putting forward this first-degree rape case. And that's the thing, too, is there were just a number of decisions that really stacked the deck for an acquittal to happen. Allowing Greta's sexual history in, the judge only directing the jury to consider a first-degree rape charge, the prosecutor dropping assault and battery charges.
Just to go back, I think, that's, I wonder if that's sort of similar to the E.G. and Carroll case, and we've seen so many cases like that. I mean, that's one of the things that victims complain about is that, they'll get a plea to a lesser charge and all of that, but that option of not having anything less than that, which it seemed like jurors, were kind of wanting, to see him as a harm doer, but not to that same level.
Right, or at least that on a first-degree rape charge, they had considerable reasonable doubt. I mean, there was one juror that I was able to speak with because enough time has passed that many have either died or were just otherwise unreachable. But this one juror that I spoke with, she definitely believed that there was enough reasonable doubt to acquit. And my sense was that she was among those who had voted to acquit early on. Many other jurors had to be convinced. But it didn't take that long in the scheme of things. It only took a few hours. And that was because they had heard Greta's testimony, but they had already heard from other witnesses, mostly brought forward by the prosecution, that seemed to undermine the case. That they spoke about Greta and John kind of needling each other, that Greta joked about
her lesbian relationship.
Her lesbian relationship, exactly. And in 2025, when I published this book, to me, it reads like she was clearly trying to troll her husband. But in 1978, we didn't have that terminology. and
Well, and
people
then
just took it literally.
then, as you point out, the defense counsel was able to say, so she's a liar, which is, of course, this, women as liar, women as temptress, women as responsible for their own victimization. That's a familiar narrative.
And in this case, it's women bringing forward a charge that shouldn't even exist in the first place. So it wasn't just about litigating the case, it was also about litigating the law's existence. And this idea of, well, why do we need a separate carve out for marital rape? It shouldn't matter. And also, you can get a divorce.
I was kind of puzzled, and I think it was one of the feminist commentators who got this wrong, but one of the things that very few people know is that, especially that there's often very little physical evidence, yet the doctor found physical evidence. Not only she'd been, beaten in the face, but that there was injury, that he concluded that forced intercourse had taken place. And that just seemed to count for nothing. And now I think more judges are educated that we can't reasonably expect that kind of physical evidence, that it doesn't exist in most cases of sexual assault, and expecting it is unreasonable. But we had it in this case.
Right. That doctor's testimony I thought was very credible. He did, of course, say that he couldn't comment whether it was rape, because in his words, rape is a legal term, not a medical term.
Right.
But he did find, in his opinion, that there were signs of forced intercourse. But the cumulative effect of Greta being painted as not trustworthy and not credible definitely swayed the jury. And John's story that it was essentially a marital tiff. Yes, he admitted to assaulting her to the beating, but that anything else was just part of the marriage. And so that's ultimately that all of that contributed to why he got acquitted. And then, of course, within a few weeks, John and Greta reunited, which really set the entire country against her, of like, why did you waste our time? Why did we have to go through this trial and try to educate ourselves about the existence of spousal rape only for this to happen, without understanding just how few options Greta actually had.
And how common that is in cases of intimate
yes.
partner violence. I remember when I first started working on this, a lawyer in the UK said it takes 7 times, 7
right.
attempts to leave. But we didn't have that vocabulary then. But that is the common thing of, why don't you just leave? So if you somehow
right.
go back, then somehow you're asking for it, or you deserve what happens to you, or whatever. And also, I think one of the things that I thought was so interesting that I didn't know about the case at all until I read your book was this kind of the intervention of this, the imposition of this religious narrative, this minister who thought that God had, told him he should reunite the two people. And they seem to have, about this much depth of religious conviction between the two of them. Yet it was really that was really powerful for them. It was really, that should happen.
I think it's also a reminder, and I had to remind myself a lot as I was working on this book, is that Greta and John were very, very young.
Right.
Greta was only 23 when the alleged assault happened. John was 21. Their daughter was 2.5. These were essentially kids who had grown up in circumstances that, were not all that great. John in particular, he definitely was lower socioeconomic status. His mother married several times. She had trouble just maintaining any kind of household. I remember one source telling me that she had witnessed the family, and they just seemed to be, very poor, very wearing rags, just in real disrepair through and through. And for someone like John, going to school was a huge victory, but he couldn't sustain it. He would get jobs, couldn't keep them. Greta would get jobs. And
it was not clear, that was kind of seemed like the precipitating event, that he, he's married, he has a 2.5-year-old child, and then he quits his job because it's interfering with his schooling. And you kind of think, well, how did you think this was all going to work? It's like this immaturity. Yeah.
The level of immaturity is quite high, and the level of impulse control is quite stark.
Yeah.
And the decision making, it was poor. And there was already a volatile marriage that had broken up several times. He had gone to Fort Stewart, Georgia for military service. And Greta was separated at the time, though she had given birth to their daughter. But considering her options, of which were very few, and having to make the rent and having to figure out how to live as a person in the world, being a single mom just didn't seem viable. So marrying him seemed like a better option, or the only option. That didn't work out for a while. Then she takes her daughter back to the Midwest and is separated and has some brief relationships and gets pregnant and has an abortion. And then John cajoles her in letters, in phone calls, and then in person visits. And again, she considers her options and is like, well, he's still the father of my kid. Might as well go back and try to make another go of it. So it's a cycle that just keeps reasserting itself. And so, of course, they would fall into the same old patterns even after such a highly publicized trial, because what else was she going to do? Was she going to make it on her own? The capacity for imagination, I think, gets really beaten down when you're in an abusive relationship with an intimate partner. And as a result, it seems like the thing you know makes more sense, even if it's the thing that hurts you the most.
Right, or just so many insurmountable obstacles like, rent and car payments and, babysitters or whatever. We have these, one of the things that's so interesting is you have this long trajectory of the book, right? So you have kind of three things. I want to ask you about all three independently. One is, we now know John is a serial rapist. And it's funny because you mentioned that you found the serial killers a little boring and the crime fiction about serial killers in particular more boring. But you do write about serial rapists as interesting. And I think that that's something we can't see of 21-year-old John. Right, we just see this young person before us, but it's easier to judge when we have this cumulative trajectory of his.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that one of the things I was trying to argue, which I say explicitly at the end of the book, is that, and I was kind of flipping this infamous quote that a California congressman said in the late 70s when he was at a dinner and California was trying to pass a spousal rape law, and he quips, if you can't rape your wife, who can you rape? And what I found, and it wasn't just with John, it was with some of the other cases that I wrote about where husbands were acquitted in the rape of their wives and then went on to harm other women. So it became, if you can rape your wife, who else can you rape? And that almost became the animating force as I researched and reported out what happened with John, and particularly with the two women whom he raped and is now serving prison time for.
Well, and also these guys like Bobbitt and Rideout and stuff seem to revel in the celebrity of their initial, charge, even if acquitted as sexual assaulters.
Right, that celebrity became the only currency that they could understand because they didn't have much else.
What do you think about this issue, though, that, it's kind of like, in certain legal systems, a woman can't be believed unless there's corroboration of two other women or something. I mean, it sort of seems like with Cosby or Weinstein or these other folks, like how, or even Larry Nassar or whatever. I mean, how many women does John Rideout have to rape before we believe Greta?
That's a really central question. And I am also fairly confident that the two women whom he sexually assaulted in 2013 and 2016, respectively, I don't think they were the only ones. There are decades worth of mystery as to what John was up to when he was bouncing around between Northern California and Oregon from the early 80s through about 2011. I don't know what happened. My reporting didn't turn up much. All I have are suspicions that I can't put on the record. But patterns definitely assert themselves. And, to go back to your point about, yes, I suppose I find serial killers kind of banal and their victims much more interesting. I mean, it's the same thing with serial rapists too. It's more just how do you lock into a pattern, and why does this pattern exist? And I think for someone like John, it's that his own self conception is so at odds with reality. And this really came through when I heard him in court, when I watched and listened to the 2017 trial, where he took the stand, which was a disaster. And then he spoke at his sentencing hearing and just kind of rambled on, and he invoked Donald Trump and he invoked this and that and science fiction. And it just felt like it was 45 minutes of grievance, but not even well articulated grievance. And I thought, this guy's not interesting.
He sounds more like an incel.
I mean, those are your words. I think there's some merit to that.
And certainly I'm entitled to these things and I'm not getting them. Yes.
Exactly. It's my right. And so that's what I mean by, I think that he has a very poor understanding of what consent actually entails, because he just believes that he's entitled to everything when it comes to an intimate partner or even an acquaintance.
Well, that was something different about this book from some of your other books, where you were able to interview people, but usually your legal research has, come from the trial transcripts or whatever. So were there other things that you got from actually being the first person witness to that you thought were important?
Oh my God. I mean, that was the first criminal trial I've ever attended in person. I've attended other court proceedings, be they civil cases or bankruptcies or antitrust and the like. So all civil. And just being present in the courtroom when voir dire was happening, I'd never witnessed that before.
Were people asked about their about coerced sex in voir dire? I've always been curious about that. Just like you ask people about, are you for or against the death penalty or whatever in a capital case, but like how people who don't want to reveal that are suddenly required to reveal it.
Unfortunately, yes. I think there was one question that the prosecutor said that how many of you would say that you have experienced sexual assault, and I wouldn't say that the majority of the jury panel raised their hands, but a sizable number of them did.
And were they dismissed for cause then?
I believe some of them were. I'd have to check my notes.
I guess there's a famous sexual harassment case at the University of Iowa, and they'd ask people, have you ever taken a women's studies course? And they were all dismissed for cause.
Oh, no. But to go back to voir dire, at least in the 2022 trial, what I was actually impressed with was the way that the prosecutor just sort of walked prospective jurors into thinking about intimate partner violence. And he started with a hypothetical of, you're going out on a hike in a sort of mountainous area, and you have your car and you leave your cell phone and you leave your door unlocked and it's stolen. Is it your fault that you left your cell phone there? And then from there, he goes on to a different kind of burglary where I think it's in the home. It's like, well, if you left your jewelry there, were you asking for it? And every scenario eventually built up to intimate partner sexual assault. And then he actually did ask the jurors about their thoughts on marital rape. Now, the actual 1978 case involving John and Greta was not part of the trial. That would have been prejudicial to introduce it as evidence. And in fact, by the 2022 case, the instance with the acquaintance, her case was also not included in this retrial because they had already litigated that, and it also would have been viewed as prejudicial. So it was just solely concentrating on the former intimate partner. But to just get the jury to kind of think through intellectually what it means to go from stolen property to sexual assault, I thought was very ingenious, because it meant that you kind of winnowed out who felt uncomfortable. There were actually one or two people who seemed very uncomfortable with the idea of marital rape as a concept. And so they were definitely excused. And ultimately they found a jury of 12. It took about 2.5 hours. And then the case itself took about a day and a half of trial testimony. And I think what also struck me is that you could put on a defense and not put on any witnesses, which I was like, that's weird. But his public defender just decided not to put on a case and was only challenging whatever testimony was coming in from
and
the
saying it's your
side.
burden.
Pretty much, yes.
Well, that really stands in stark contrast to your description of the prosecutor in the original case, who sounds like he would have been excluded from that jury because I don't think he believed in marital rape, did he?
I think he had a hard time with the concept. I think that's fair to say.
And also, he's another person where you get the long view of it. He does not come out very well historically as ending up going to prison, right?
He did, yes, for financial improprieties, and it was around the time when the TV movie had come out, so he was not available to give his opinion on what it was like to be represented on TV.
But he
had
did
bigger
seem
problems to deal with.
He did seem just to make a lot of gargantuan blunders, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, dropping the assault and battery charge, making comments around closing arguments that he didn't
He's
think
not
that
going to
John
do
deserved.
time. Yeah,
Right, he's not going to get prison time. That he seems like a nice young man. He shouldn't be
oh
in prison.
my God. Yeah, that's very. I thought all of that was very troubling. Of course, it's probably overdetermined, right? If you have people that don't believe Greta, people don't believe in marital rape, and a bad defense, it's like I don't know how you really untangle those. But do you think? But you do report, interestingly enough, that the press corps believes he was guilty, right? Even if the jurors didn't.
But that didn't emerge until Helen Benedict interviewed them. So it took about 13 or 14 years for them to say that. At the time, no one
revealed that in their columns. You said one person was a little, she kind of showed her hand a little. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think the Post's Cynthia Gorney wrote some really good after the fact features on the trial, and it was pretty clear what she thought from those pieces, although she never said it outright.
Okay.
But if you were writing for the Associated Press, United Press International, or any of the wire services, you were not giving your opinion at all.
You're just reporting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, there's so many questions I want to ask you about that case, but I actually think, as somebody who kind of does social movement stuff, history of second wave feminism, I was so interested by Laura X. And
he is a fascinating character. That is definitely true.
And I thought that chapter really captured so many things about that time period really beautifully. And it's interesting to me that she has been kind of so absent from any of the narrative. I had never heard of her before. And I think that just attests to the kind of, I don't know, boutique isn't really the right word, but kind of the niche way people think about marital rape within sexual assault, so that she, also just her, her projects for the archives and really, she was really a profoundly altruistic person. In working on this cause, it seems like for a very long time and quite successful.
I would definitely agree with that. She came from privilege. She was very uncomfortable with that privilege. She tried to rebel against that privilege. But she also had this trust fund that she channeled into her archival projects, be it the Center for Women's History, and then eventually the National Clearinghouse for Marital and Date Rape. And so as a result, she was basically a self-taught librarian and was very obsessed with collecting everything of the record related to a given topic. So I remember visiting her in 2023, and by then the National Center had long since been defunct, but she still had all these boxes, like boxes and boxes piled up. And I think just...
What happened to all those? Did she end up putting them in an archive or something? Did it go to the Schlesinger Library or something?
Some of it did, but a lot of it she kept. Some of it was in St. Louis. And unfortunately, as I describe at the end of the book, she did lose her home, and
Okay.
she's still living in San Francisco, but times have not been terribly kind to Laura, unfortunately, which is again another reminder that we have to look after people and give them care and remember their contributions.
Right.
But it's very easy to be neglected and erased and forgotten, especially if you're a woman, even if you're a woman who came from privilege. But the work that she did, I don't think anybody else could have done it in the way that Laura X did. And she is a fascinating character.
Because she was so articulate, or because of those archival skills,
I
or
think it
just
was just
her
I think it was
strategy?
the strategy, but also doggedness, but also she knew enough to find people who could help her, legal interns. I learned in my research that Catherine McKinnon briefly was an intern for her at the National Center. A number
Wow.
of a number of feminists of the second wave and later definitely worked on projects related to marital rape. But it really was just understanding that you would get victories and change things on the legislative front. So if you start with California, then which states next and which states next? And it became this kind of snowball effect. And then her work galvanized other activists. And so in tandem, that's what led to this rolling change from very few states that made marital rape a crime to all of them. And then in the late 90s, Laura X published a paper called Accomplishing the Impossible, which was essentially a timeline of all of the work that she had done up until then. And so my view is that her activism in marital rape was successful. It did lead to an outcome that could be defined as an ending. All 50 states made marital rape a crime.
And some successful prosecutions, which you
And
document. Not all, but
yes,
some.
not all.
And we can't kind of we one of the things we don't have is kind of a sense of how many, right? If like you start with this, let's say 10%. Let's assume 10% of married people, right, according to Diana Russell and the other studies. Yes. Then how many of them make a claim? We don't have that kind of same statistic for marital rape that we do for maybe maybe it's, I don't know, like is it captured in kind of the behavioral measures of the crime victim things? I mean, it's probably not.
I mean, the National Center did document marital rape cases pretty extensively in the 80s and 90s.
Okay.
So there were sort of ad hoc statistics from there. More recently, I think the nonprofit Equitas has been keeping track, at least in a sort of, semi-sporadic way. My understanding is that they're getting new data, and hopefully sometime this year they're going to release what they have. So their data showed that the percentages of women who were married or in intimate partner relationships who had experienced sexual assault was pretty well in line with what Diana Russell and also Kirsty Elo and David Finkelhor reported in License to Rape, that it's somewhere in the 10 to 14% range, and that's almost certainly an undercount. So if it is as prevalent,
right, because we assume sexual coercion is part of other kinds of violence, right? So,
yes.
So that would lead you to think that number would be higher.
Right, and so it's strange to think of it as sort of from an intersectional standpoint, but I think we have to, that you can't just silo off marital rape as a separate thing, even though sometimes relationships are siloed off that way, where the perpetrator will not physically assault his partner, but may sexually assault them, or they may physically assault and never, quote, sexually assault them, or there may be a mix. But in siloing it off, it did mean, and Diana Russell talked about this in the early 90s, that she felt frustrated that it was very difficult for her to get funding for additional research. She felt marginalized by domestic violence advocates who just wanted to focus on assault and not get into the whole rape stuff because it just felt like it was complicating matters. And so as a result, I think that just contributed to the sense of it became the topic that people didn't talk about. And
It is kind of part just the way the movement developed, so that there's these two parallel, non-intersecting tracks, which we're dealing with in Iowa at the moment. But, you know, even, yeah. So the sexual assault people sometimes think that the DV people can't deal with, won't deal with anything but intimate partner sexual assault. But then the question is whether the DV people are actually dealing with sexual assault, intimate partner sexual assault at all, let alone everything else. Yet a number of programs now are under one banner.
Right.
So there should be more cross-fertilization, but it still seems to me like two parallel, non-intersecting tracks
I
of
think you're right. And I think
activism.
having more interaction and more discussion and dialogue and a sense that people can talk about this stuff more openly and that people understand them, it's so paramount. But since it's already so difficult for women in general to report sexual assaults of any kind, be it strangers or intimate partners, and then it just, the difficulty just gets added to and added to. So no wonder we don't have these discussions more widely.
Yeah, I think so. One of the motivations for me in doing the podcast is that I feel that there's a similar phenomenon among academics. So scholars tend to stay in their lane in sexual assault. So the psychologists talk to each other, the law people talk to each other, historians, and so forth. And then there's the thing that we just discussed, but also it seems like, people like you who are kind of the investigative journalists, you are extremely well versed, in the other investigative journalists that are working in this kind of issue. And so I'm just wondering about and it also seems to me, that we have the people who are writing for a wider audience, not necessarily social scientists or scholars. I think your work really is accessible to a really wide audience. Then we have the scholars who are in their disciplinary lane, and then we have, the people at the rape crisis centers or the people at the nonprofits that are also very, very fragmented, and there just seems to be no kind of cross-fertilization to me. So and the field seems to be very fragmented. I mean, I just sort of feel like I just kind of blindly stumble across one thing or another, or kind of what happens to me is that people I refer to as kind of my rape pen pals, they'll say, oh, did you see this piece? Someone's writing a book about rape kits, or did you see this person, is writing about freezing, or this is in a law journal that you might not know about. So how did you go about in your research, because you do cite the academic research as well as a lot of the stuff about popular culture. How do you try to kind of overcome that difficulty of working in that field?
I mean, it helps that this isn't my first book. So as a result, if Without Consent had been my first book, I think I would have struggled. I mean, I struggled with it plenty for a lot of different reasons. But in terms of the writing of it, I always knew how to tell the story, which was, essentially chronological, with this middle section talking about specific cases, both acquittals and convictions, that helped further along the overall goal, which was to get all 50 states to criminalize spousal rape. So I knew that when you're writing a work of narrative nonfiction, it's important that a difficult a subject has to still be, I wouldn't say easy to read, but palatable. That there's a narrative, there's pacing, there are people that I can describe in such a way that, they are characters. I mean, in nonfiction, it gets a little squirrely to talk about actual human beings as characters, but for the purposes of the form, yes, they are characters. And it was really important for me to figure out, especially talking about Greta and John and the trial, what it was like to be in Salem, Oregon at that time, and then later. So all of these elements were really crucial to me, but it was also important because I'm writing narrative nonfiction. I had to get it right. So that meant I did have to read a lot of academic papers. I did talk to a number of academics. I did talk to lawyers, some of them who were just toiling in random law firms in Salt Lake City and California, but they happened to have written amazing academic papers while law students that really helped inform my thinking about what was happening with current loopholes in spousal rape laws, or thinking through what might happen to spousal rape in a post-Dobbs world and how scary that might be. So all of that research, all of that reading was really fundamental for giving me a solid background. Even like reading selections of History of the Pleas of the Crown by Sir Matthew Hale. I had to
See,
get through that.
I had not, I thought that was a particularly, I guess I might be one of the quirky people who really appreciate your contribution on that point, because you're sort of saying he was published without his consent, because other people have written about him.
When I figured that out, I was kind of blown away that nobody had made this point before. I thought, really? Did they not realize that this should never have been published? But again, it just goes to show that that's how stubborn patriarchy is. That even if Sir Matthew Hale's work had never seen the light of day, something like it would.
Well, that's a context that is often missing, I think, from that piece of information. Like somehow he single-handedly, created this thing, as opposed to really captured a white standing view that he shared, that has become intractable. And so that's the problem we have with rape law reform, right, is that you can have the removal of the Hill charge, but the same consequences as if the charge was made in terms of, the ideology of a juror or a prosecutor or a wider public. I think you also really captured beautifully the challenge of, I watch a lot of crime fiction, and you're watching the person. I mean, I was thinking of this in Landman recently. The son goes in and he just starts talking to the police without a lawyer, and you say, come on, dude, surely you've watched enough crime fiction to know that this is not going to work to your advantage if you're going to be charged with murder, but you kind of have that feeling of, watching the disaster of John and Greta try to deal with the press, the morning talk show hosts, documentarians, and then figuring out, this is maybe not, in my best interest. And I am not going to be able to manage this whole scene very well.
I mean, no one was really looking out for either of them, but particularly hardly anyone was looking out for Greta. I think Helen Bibelheimer was, but she was limited in what she could do. She could host Greta and her daughter while the trial was going on, but once it was over, she had to get back to her own life and her own children and the bookstore that she was trying to keep afloat.
And she, as you point out, I actually haven't seen the made-for-TV movie of the case, but you say that she's particularly misrepresented in that case. And that's sort of like, I don't know, is that like checking the box? Oh, we're not being overly feminist because we trashed Helen?
Yeah, I think it's a sense of, well, we have to have an angry feminist in there as a foil.
Right, who's brainwashing the person who really wants to just go back to her husband, or who, or something. I don't know. It just who's telling her it's rape when it isn't, or whatever. In which is exactly not the case in Greta's case. I mean, she says it, says it to the police, and it's kind of her decision. Even if she doesn't think of herself as particularly brave. Well, I have so many questions. I guess maybe the last thing I ask you is maybe like a nerdy question about. So tell me about the MA in forensic science and your master's thesis, and how, if any, that has shaped your consumption of crime fiction or your thoughts about the whole process.
Long before I was a writer, I operated on two different tracks growing up. One was the music side. I took piano lessons. I studied voice from the age of 13. I've been in choir since I was 15 years old, and I'm still in one today. And I was also studying science and quite good at it. I was good at writing, but I like to joke that I wasn't the writer in the family. My older brother is also a published author.
It's weird how families are like, you can only have one, Yeah,
and and it's not even something that our parents specifically decided. It's just, there's a writer and there's a scientist. So I went to McGill for my undergraduate degree and studied biology. And in my senior year, because at that point I was already a very serious reader of crime fiction and of true crime. And I remember looking at papers in my local hometown about missing and murdered women and girls and just being horrified, but also fascinated and wondering what that was all about. So that longstanding fascination in crime kind of subsumed itself when I learned about John Jay College having a forensic science program. And I thought, oh my God, crime and science together? And I can be in New York City, the one city in the world that I want to live in? This is too good to be true. And the tuition was super cheap because it was.
Had you been reading Patricia Cornwell by then, or did she exist yet, or?
She did.
Okay, because I think she was like the first, wasn't she like the first kind of the feminist forensic scientist, or?
So Postmortem, her first Case Scarpetta novel came out in 1990, and I know this because it's just about to be reissued, and there's a TV show coming with Nicole Kidman as Scarpetta.
Oh, wow, okay.
So Cornwell was never a forensic pathologist. She did work in a medical examiner's office, I think as an assistant in Richmond. So she got a lot of knowledge and research from that, but she herself was never a doctor. But there had not been a sort of forensic science-oriented crime novel until Postmortem. So it was a new thing. And it became a huge hit. And then, Kathy Reichs did that with forensic anthropology later, and other sort of forensic-minded writers rose to prominence as well. I mean, interestingly enough, there seems to be a de-emphasis, and I think it's just because forensic science in general has taken a lot of lickings as we discover just
that's how much not the magic panacea for all questions of doubt.
No, and a lot of it, unfortunately, turned out to be junk science. So needless to say, I get into grad school. I go to John Jay College, which is part of the city university system. It also means that my tuition is a lot cheaper than most graduate schools would be. And I arrive in August of 2001. So within a few weeks, September 11th happens.
Wow.
And while I am just, in class, studying in the lab, also working one day a week at a wonderful mystery bookshop that no longer exists called Partners in Crime. But some of my classmates were also working professionals, and they had to process the material, like they had to identify
remains,
those who had died in the attacks at the ME's office or at the trace evidence lab in the NYPD. So being up close to that, it wasn't, and the following summer I did an internship at the ME's office in their investigations department, which really afforded me kind of an up close and personal view, not only of the work, but also the way that the work took a toll on the pathologists, on the forensic biologists working in the DNA lab, on visiting professionals who were trying to identify remains. And that made a profound impression upon me. And I still remember one of the investigators sort of joking, it's like, oh, you're going to end up writing about us, aren't you? I was like, I don't know, I'm 23, what is going on? But needless to say, and I'm, jumping through fast forwarding a lot, but I finished my studies. My master's thesis was in something related to single nucleotide polymorphisms. I did the work at King's College in London through an exchange program. And then I came back to my native Canada to work on the thesis, which was kind of in disarray. I would not recommend you read it. I barely remember writing it. It was just a sense of, okay, we just got to get through so you can graduate. I did graduate, and unlike a lot of my classmates who got jobs but never finished the degree, I finished the degree but never got a forensic science job. And it was because
you did kind of get a forensic science job.
I mean, in the not a traditional forensic biology doing DNA analysis job, which is what I applied for and interviewed for. And when I didn't get the fourth or fifth one, I realized the problem clearly had to be me. And what I came to realize is that clearly I was giving off some vibe that I didn't want this enough, or that I was frustrated. I realized I didn't actually like working in the lab. It was terribly frustrating and repetitive. I made a lot of mistakes. I wasn't good at it. But I was interested in sort of the bigger picture, in cases, in people, in how crimes were investigated and how wrongful convictions happened. And I thought, well, okay, if I'm not going to be a lab person, maybe I can start writing. And so I started a blog, which led to my first professional bylines as a book reviewer. I published fiction, I published journalism, and a new snowball started where, one thing led to another. And now here I am talking to you about my third nonfiction book.
Well, you're incredibly productive. If you were in a department, you would definitely be a full professor. But I just want to say, I've had the pleasure of diving into your other books that aren't necessarily all about sexual violence. And I do want to just congratulate you on the accomplishment of this book, because I think much as the other books are really good, I think that this has this legal and historical and social movement context built around these set of cases that is really powerful and a huge contribution, in addition to just telling this story kind of from the journalistic crime reporter point of view. So thank you so much for talking to me, and thank you so much for writing this book, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure to talk through. And I think you're right. This book challenged me in so many different ways. And obviously writing about sexual assault is incredibly difficult. It certainly took a toll, but the toll that it took on me pales in comparison to the toll suffered by all of the survivors that I wrote about from Greta onward. And it's really important to just recognize that and say that out loud, but also that I wrote this book because it didn't seem to exist. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I think Without Consent may be the first book about spousal rape written for kind of a layperson's audience in about 40 years, maybe since License to Rape.
I think that's right. I mean, I can't say I know everything in the field, but I've been working for about 13 or 14 years kind of reading, and that's really what caught my attention and made me immediately get it and immediately read it and recognize its importance. So I think it is a really, really important contribution. And so thank you so much for that. And I'm looking forward to what you do next, and let's stay in touch.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
We will.
Okay.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
I owe a debt of gratitude to many who contributed to the second half of Season 2 now that I have moved home to Iowa. Music credit goes to the talented Jerry Lee Kenny on saxophone and to the late Dwight Champagne for his original composition, Surrender. Thanks to all my new friends and colleagues at Amplified in Des Moines, Amner Martinez, Laura Rodriguez, Aki Petavine for production and edging me into video. I would also like to thank the many students in my classes on rape and gender-based violence over the years for all I have learned from them, my rape pen pals, and my newfound community of those working to end sexual violence in Iowa, in particular through the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Lastly, I'd like to thank the many survivors, not just scholars, who disclosed to me as students over the last 37 years, especially those in the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, 13 of whom just received their undergraduate degrees from Tulane University in October, and the Homestead Correctional Institute for Women. Your courage, humor, resilience, and determination to find joy showed me the way.